Well, as we come to the end of this course, I wanted to give you some materials and a general question that I might have asked at the beginning, and that is, can we as individual human beings handle death, handle the thought of our own mortality? And I suppose by saying handle, I mean, can we accept it? And I guess in a real way, can we assimilate the fact that our lives will come to an end into our view of the future and ourselves? And I wanted to give you some things that I've gathered on which I think speak to that question, different views of that. As always in a philosophy course, the important thing is really not to gain information. The important thing is to hook into certain questions, which you begin to ask for yourselves. And of course, we look to sources. We look to great thinkers of the past, especially to guide us, and we evaluate their answers. But the important thing is to ask the question for yourself and to come up with your own. I've given you various materials for this week, various views, which I think really speak to that question of whether we can handle death. And I had to give you this excerpt from Epictetus, the ancient philosopher, 1st, 2nd century AD, the great Stoic, who had a certain view of that, and of that question of how we should regard our deaths, and it really fits into his general philosophy. This is the beginning of the handbook, the Enchiridion, which pretty much shapes everything. The general principle here that shapes everything to come. And what he says is some things are in our control and others not. Right? In life, there are some things that you can actually control. There are some things that you have the capacity to control, and there are others that you don't. And he lists the kind of things that he thinks are in our control. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, property, reputation, command, and in one word, whatever are not our own actions. A very radical idea there, actually. I mean, what Epictetus is saying is that as far as external things, our actions in the world, the success or failure of our projects in the world, those things are not in our control. And that's something we don't, we're not encouraged to believe, really. We're encouraged to believe that we can do anything, and maybe we can. But Epictetus reminds us that that's not really up to us, success or failure in the world. We can try, we should try. But ultimately, if you want to become rich, you should go for it. But you may end up poor. If you want to start a family and raise kids and, have a long-term relationship with somebody else, that's a great thing. You should go ahead and try. But they may not happen. None of these things are hopeless, but ultimately, whether or not they work, whether or not we get the object of our desire and our wish, is ultimately not up to us. Then what is up to us? Well, as he says, things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, etc. Our thoughts are in our control. Our feelings, what we want, and desires, that they are in our control. And how we respond to the world is in our control. Whether I'm successful in any pursuit, ultimately, again, it's not that I shouldn't try, but ultimately the success in that project is something that I can't ensure, right? But what I can ensure, what I can determine in an absolute way is how I respond to the outcomes of my projects. If I succeed, How I feel about that success is entirely up to me. If I fail, how I feel about that failure is entirely up to me. And as he goes on here, he says, the things in our control are by nature free, unrestrained, unhindered. But those not in our control are weak, slavish, restrained, belonging to others. Remember then that if you suppose that things which are slavish by nature are also free, and that what belongs to others is your own, then you will be hindered. You will lament. You will be disturbed, and you will find fault both with gods and men. But if you suppose that only to be your own, which is your own, and what belongs to others, such as it really is, then no one will ever compel you or restrain you. Further, you will find fault with no one or accuse no one. You will do nothing against your will. No one will hurt you. You will have no enemies, and you will not be harmed. Sorry, you'll garble the text there. It's really a prescription for being a free person in Epictetus's way. Right? That is, if your desires, your hopes, your state of mind, your happiness depend upon what belongs to others, you will not be happy. You will be disturbed. But if you concentrate on the things that really are your own, the things that you can control and determine, then you'll be free. And I suppose the promise is that you will be happy. Well, if we think about, that which, is really not in our control, which we could never say is in our control. We dispute these things, what is really in our control, what's not, then death is not in your control. We avoid it, of course, as much as we can, like Ariel's fencing master in Game of Thrones, where we began. He says, we say to death, not today. But whether it's today or tomorrow, no matter how prudent we are and how much we plan, we can't determine whether it's today or tomorrow. And we know that it will be eventually, right? So what does Epictetus have to say about that? Well, there's this little, remember, he says this further on in the book. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the principles and notions which they form concerning things. His idea was, and this is, radical idea, is that nothing in itself really is good or bad. What makes it good or bad is your response to it. Things in themselves are not horrifying or terrible or disappointing or painful. What determines whether something's painful to you is whether you respond to it in a certain way. So he goes on and says, death, for instance, is not terrible. Else it would have appeared so to Socrates, the great hero, right? If Socrates didn't think death was terrible, remember that. Death, for instance, is not terrible, but the terror consists in our notion of death, that it is terrible. What makes death terrible is not that death is terrible. What makes death terrible is that we think death is terrible. When, therefore, we are hindered or disturbed or grieved, let us never attribute it to others, but to ourselves. That is, to our own principles. Well, that's a quite interesting and radical and demanding idea. That whether death is terrible, like anything else, whether it's disturbing, whether it's painful, whether it's dreadful, as maybe the existentialists would say, that if you find death dreadful, it's not because death is dreadful. If you find death dreadful, it's because you find death dreadful, and you have the power to approach it in a different way, to see it in a different way. And it's really quite something. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. And the other materials that I've given you this week are certainly meant to provide a different view, a rebuttal to this notion that we can really handle death in the way that Epictetus says we can, that we can assimilate it, accept it, adopt a rational attitude towards it, and not let it get to us. That we have the power to do that. That is, quite a striking position, and not one which is obviously true. And the other materials are meant to provide a different perspective.